Hello, greetings, highly esteemed people. Did a high-technology civilization exist in ancient India? This is a question many people around the world are asking. Most of us have heard over the years various interesting stories about discoveries from deep antiquity that are shocking, strange, and provoke the imagination and debate among scientists. Do you remember the Egyptian hieroglyphs depicting helicopters and airplanes, images of flying ships, and even people dressed in something like spacesuits, painted in artworks from different periods or even on cave walls? Mysteries and secrets of this kind have been discovered all over the globe since time immemorial. But while in modern history the age of nuclear physics eventually arrived, many plots from ancient legends of various peoples were described by historians merely as mythologies and fairy tales. Later, however, scientists began to pay them more serious attention, especially those from the ancient East and from one of the most ancient cultures in the world, the Indian one. Unnecessary units. At the beginning of the 12th century of our era, the mathematician and astronomer Bhaskara Acharya, the teacher, lived in India. In one of his works, Siddhanta Shiromani's The Crown of Doctrine, among the many units of time measurement there appears the unique Trudy, which equals 0.031 microseconds, or 10 to the power of 7. Specialists who study the works of ancient Indian scholars to this day ponder and try to guess for what exact purposes the creation of such a unit was needed, and what exactly the ancients measured with it. To make it even more interesting, in an even more ancient Sanskrit text, Brihatsakatha, numerous units of time with extremely small durations are described, such as Kashta and Kala, and the smallest of them represents a time interval equal to 300 thousand of a second. But how and why did the ancient Indians use units of the type of microseconds? For them to exist, they must have had some meaning, practical application. And in that case, the ancients must have been able to measure them as well. With what? Modern physicists know very well that the lifetime of some elementary particles, hyperons and mesons, is approximately 1/300 billionth of a second. To assume that the ancient Indians understood quantum physics in the distant past is somewhat strange, isn't it? But not for them. In yet another ancient text, Varahamihira, written around 550 BCE, there are mathematical quantities suspiciously describing the size of the hydrogen atom. Another inexplicable mystery, isn't it? The guardians of mysterious knowledge, in 1966, the American researcher of archaeological mysteries Thomas Andrews visited the Indian city of Madras, where he learned interesting stories from the local yogi pandit Kaniya. According to the Indian, Brahmin scholars from time immemorial were obliged to preserve and remember a large amount of information that they themselves did not understand. Their distant ancestors had passed down the knowledge that matter consists of an infinite number of particles, atoms, and that most of the space within the atoms themselves is not filled with matter. Even that within this emptiness there exist vast worlds. Andrews writes about all these conversations in his book, We Are Not the First, published in London in 1976. But who needed such information 500 years ago? Many researchers believe that in the distant epochs of Earth there existed a civilization which, in its level of knowledge in physics and technology, was not inferior to the modern one. Perhaps it even surpassed it. The very fact that members of the highest priestly caste were obliged to memorize a number of mathematical and physical symbols and quantities without understanding their meaning testifies that someone attempted to preserve and pass into the future the knowledge accumulated during a past technological epoch. This attempt apparently succeeded to a large extent, because it is clear that in those ancient times the knowledge existed and even had practical significance. Therefore, it may not be very strange that the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus, who lived 500 years ago, and his follower Epicurus somehow knew that in nature there exists nothing but atoms and empty space, and that the atom is the smallest indivisible particle of substances. 400 years after them, the Roman Lucretius wrote that invisible atoms constantly move in space and even collide with one another, undergoing an infinite number of changes. But in those times none of these scholars mentioned, and probably did not suspect, units of measurement such as truta and kashta, and what was measured with them. And only 203 centuries later, no one was interested in, mentioned, or remembered atoms. Interest in them reappeared only at the turn between the 19th and 20th centuries. What did the ancient earthlings fight with? In the Sanskrit texts of the ancient Indian epic Mahabharata, consisting of 18 books and more than 200,000 verses, there is information about religion, worldview, customs, the history of ancient India, as well as legends about their gods and heroes. The epic dates to around 1500 BCE, but the events described in it occurred much earlier, tens of thousands of years back. A significant part of the Mahabharata is devoted to military actions involving gods, demigods, and humans. Scholars consider that these events refer to semi-legendary stories about conflicts on the territory of India with tribes from the north, Aryans, and most mysteriously, among the usual stories of ancient battles, there are quite detailed descriptions of battles that include artillery, rockets, warplanes, and even nuclear weapons. In Dronaparva, one of the books of the Mahabharata, a battle is described during which there are explosions of projectiles resembling huge balls of fire. In the same text, the emergence of a huge mushroom-shaped cloud is described. Characteristic of nuclear explosions, the cloud is described as the gradual unfolding of an umbrella. And the interesting part continues. After these explosions, food became poisoned, and the few remaining living people fell ill with something like radiation sickness. They vomited, their hair and nails fell out, and then death followed. The texts say that people in the affected zone could save themselves if they carefully washed their entire bodies in river waters. This resembles a description of the process of decontamination after passing through a radiation-contaminated area. Here is a quote presenting the use of what may be nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, A single projectile exploded with devastating force. A heated column of smoke and blinding flame rose into the sky with the light of tens of thousands of suns. This was the weapon, the Iron Thunderbolt, which turned entire races of the Vrishnis and Andakas into ashes. The bodies of the dead were so burned that they could not be recognized, and all the birds around were left without feathers. Within a few hours the food was completely poisoned, and only a few warriors escaped the fire, who threw themselves into the river to wash themselves and their weapons. What did they fly with? Every nuclear weapon requires means of delivery. In the Mahabharata, it is said that this problem had been solved. The epic contains detailed and realistic descriptions of rocket designs, airplanes, and even strange devices and mechanisms. However, the most detailed accounts concern the ancient aircraft, the Vimanas. In the book Samarangana Sutradhara, they are even compared with one another by type. The advantages and disadvantages of each kind are listed, their flight characteristics, methods of landing. Special attention is given to the properties of construction materials, wood, light metals, and alloys, as well as substances used to create propulsion, thrust. Strangely, mercury is also added among the latter. Here is a description of a Vimana flight. With the help of mercury, a Vimana can acquire power comparable to that of lightning. If its iron engine is filled with mercury and its upper part is heated, it begins to develop power, producing sounds like the roar of lions. Then the machine instantly finds itself in the sky. In the Ramayana, it is told that people saw the god Rama and his wife Sita during a flight from Sri Lanka to India. The author writes everything with such details that can truly be seen only from a great height. The ancient aircraft itself is described as possessing incredibly high speed, maneuverability, and having compartments with windows and comfortable seating. Opponents of nuclear weapons. It is characteristic that in both mentioned epics concerns are expressed about the consequences following the use of nuclear weapons. In the Mahabharata, there are verses that could fully be used by today's advocates of a world without such weapons. Here is one of the slogans: "You, cruel and vile people, intoxicated and blinded by power with the help of your iron thunderbolt, will bring destruction upon your own people." The Ramayana adds, "The arrow of death has such power that it can destroy the whole earth in a single minute." In the book Mausala Parva, there is a verse about the awakening realization that nuclear weapons pose a real threat to the whole world. It even mentions something like nuclear disarmament. After painful reflection, the Lord ordered the iron thunderbolt to be destroyed, to be broken into pieces, and they to be ground into dust. He called people to throw this dust into the sea, aliens or humans. In the books of Erich von Däniken, numerous fragments from ancient texts of various peoples are described, in which the action of nuclear weapons is apparently depicted. Therefore, this author, as well as many others, have for years been convinced supporters of the thesis of contacts between humanity and extraterrestrials that occurred in deep antiquity. He believes that weapons of mass destruction were used in antiquity by extraterrestrial civilizations, not by humans themselves. His conclusion is that it is quite unlikely that civilized aliens would decide to use nuclear bombs against Earthlings armed with bows and arrows. Even leaving aside the moral aspect of the question, intelligent aliens would realize that such a thing would be economically impractical, and they would certainly have at hand something just as effective, but not so polluting and devastating. Thus, the supposed nuclear wars in the past were probably not fought between advanced aliens from space and earthly peasants, but either among the aliens themselves or among humans who had reached an advanced technological level, especially in the military field. And since there are reports of such phenomena in many cultures, the conflict likely extended across the entire planet. And since those ancient civilizations no longer exist, their use of nuclear weapons would be a good lesson for today's superpowers.